Hi everyone, I'm going to be doing my Teach the Book presentation, so I'm just going to pull it up and start screen sharing. Okay, so my book was American Babylon, Race and the Struggle for Postwar Oakland, and it was written by Robert Self. So to begin, just a little bit of a summary. So the book really focuses on the effects of post-war metropolitan growth and decline. Oakland and a lot of similar cities at the time grew greatly after World War II as an influx of jobs and consumerism was happening, and then they soon fell into a decline towards the 1970s. And his book kind of takes us from a little bit pre-war and then jumps into that post-war economy. So in particular, Self focuses on the struggle for racial equality, specifically in housing and employment. So those are kind of like the two big keys that he talks about throughout the book. Everything's kind of related to those struggles. Um, and then he also talks about the evolution of the civil rights movement and more so the role of the Black Panther Party as it was really big in Oakland. And they set up a lot of headquarters and organization there. And then finally, he also talks about suburbanization and its effects on society. And since this book does focus more on race, specifically how white supremacy and white privilege is perpetuated through suburbia and the ways that it affected the African American community, especially in Oakland. So his central argument, this is a quote right from the book, regional and local political economies with their own cultural, political, and structural constraints presented unique and specific segregation and discrimination. It's kind of a loaded quote, but what he's saying from that is that there's all these cities in the United States that are having these moments of civil rights. And while they all have similarities to them, we have to look at them through their own individual lenses in order to give them the respect that they deserve. Certainly, there were national strategies for dealing with these kinds of issues, so housing and employment in particular, but Self says that the differences from city to city are striking. And when we look at these kinds of communities, we need to move away from this trope of the Black ghettos and that once Black people were put into these neighborhoods, they didn't do anything about it and they just fell into this kind of like, oh, lazy state of mind. Instead, we need to recognize that these communities responded with creative and productive ways to counter or at least fight against as much as they could a lot of these structural inequities and discrimination policies that were getting put against them. So then to begin talking about the chapters, chapter 1 first talks about the general strike. So this occurred in 1946, where about 1,000 members of the African Federation of Labor, known as the AFL, shut down the economy of Oakland and 4 local cities for about 2.5 days. So we're really starting to begin seeing protests against labor inequality and the rise of unions. So then we move into talking about the Metropolitan Oakland Area Program. And oh, what happened? Okay, something weird happened there, but let's get back. Okay, so the Metropolitan Oakland Area Program. This was created to outline ways to ensure post-war economic development in Oakland, as there was aggressive metropolitan economic growth. And then we move into the industrial garden city model. This is another topic that Self brought up, where a lot of similar places to Oakland, like places like Detroit, Chicago, those kind of cities are implementing this style. So it's this idea that like when the factory workers come home, they want to live in a place that has a garden with a patio and a vegetable garden that's walkable distance to the factory. And it makes the children and the family happy and healthy, and it has all these positive benefits, and it's also kind of geared towards your life at work. So you work your day and then you come home and relax. It's this cyclical thing. And the biggest thing is that it's walking distance from the factory. It's the idea that the workers and the employers could live in the same place, which we know is never really the case. So it was also kind of an idea that came from modernization at this time, and specifically Westernization. It's putting down this like nomadic lifestyle that we may have seen more before World War II, as people now are settling. They have money, consumerism and materialism is on the rise, so they want to have transportation and the white picket fence kind of lifestyle. So that's becoming really popular. And then also, Oakland is becoming a center for shipbuilding, troop transportation, food processing, and naval supply. So it's really becoming an industrial hub, like a lot of those cities that I mentioned before are starting to do. Um, and then moving into the African American working class culture, a lot of the labor geared for the African American individuals was menial jobs, but it was considered cosmopolitan within their community. So by that, Self chooses that word to kind of explain the class system within a class. So it looks better if you are working, even if you're working on a train car or in a kitchen or as a butler, at least it's work and that's elevating you. That was kind of the idea at this time. And then along with that, like I talked about, the rise of unions, one in particular is the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and that one gets brought up a lot in this chapter. And conversations are starting to be held after World War II about racial equality, which is going to lead into the ups and downs of housing and employment. Okay, so then in chapter 2, he begins talking about Oakland's Voter League, or the OVL, and they hope to take the power out of the tower by winning a majority of seats on the Oakland City Council for more progressive candidates. So they're kind of looking towards eliminating candidates who have been in power, have long lasted in power, and moving that to more liberal ideas. C.E. Dellums is a key figure in Oakland at this time. He is the city's most prominent Black leader and one of the most important civil rights figures in California. He led the West Coast Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters for 30 years and really worked hard for trade unionists. And then in 1940s, Self outlines these 3 different leadership poles within the African American community. So it's the trade unionists, the ministers, and professionals, which I found interesting because last week on our discussion board, we were talking about kind of the role of ministers in the civil rights movement. So I wanted to include that. And then the East Bay Democratic Club was the Bay Area's most important African American political organization. It also worked with the Berkeley Democratic Party to run a candidate for the California Assembly. They really wanted to put an African American individual in the state legislature who would represent the working class and those living in the flatlands. And then moving into this pamphlet you can see on the right hand bottom corner, it's coming out of the NAACP, and it says, "Keep Mississippi out of California." So this was a tactic to get people to side with their voting for moving into the legislature. It was this idea that an anti-union idea comes from the South, and California shouldn't be the same as the South. So the image is of a man whipping another man with words surrounding anti-unionist ideas. So kind of like a tactic to get people to not want to be against unions, as they provided a lot of the care for their workers, as we know. Okay, then moving into chapter 3, it's starting to mention suburbanization. So the 3 primary sets of interests that came to shape suburbanization, these came from Fred Cox, who's the president of the Southern Alameda County Real Estate Board. And Robert Self quotes him in this. So the first one is the federal state. This is the post-war home ownership development that was possible from massive state subsidies. So that's how individuals were able to afford and move into these suburban houses. The next came local city builders. These were almost universally middle-class professionals. They were industrialists. They were modest landowners and merchants, kind of like that upper middle class kind of people building these kinds of homes. And then lastly were the homeowners. So a lot of these people were first-time buyers. They were families of World War II, and oftentimes they were veterans who were purchasing homes with the help of the VA. So Cox says that all three of these are the reason that suburbanization came to be. A culmination of all of them led to the success of the suburb. And so then we see it booming in these industrialized cities, and then the surrounding areas, like these factory workers, as I mentioned, want to be close enough to where they work, but they also want to have a place to raise a family. So it's like best of both worlds, but in reality, as I'll keep mentioning, it's not going to be the best of both worlds for much of the community. A big part of the growth of suburbs was also the emergence of classes and segregation among white policymakers as a way to handle healthy property markets. So certain language that's being used to sell certain houses in areas, like this is considered a safe area, you could raise a family here. Well, all the neighbors are white. There's a reason that these real estate agents are going to be speaking in that way to certain families. Suburbs can be really credited to a link to white supremacy. And then chapter 4 kind of starts talking about the not so great parts of Oakland. So starting with a bit of the decline for the city. So specifically urban decline and blight. So blight is a term used to describe the visible and physical decline of a city. And urban decline is this idea that the city itself is not doing well. It's falling apart. There's areas that need to be cleaned up and they need to be kind of like scraped out and redone. So this was countered with the idea of urban renewal, where these areas that were considered slums would be cleaned out and replaced with more useful and newer and cleaner facilities and things such as like highways. That was a really big part of urban renewal. In reality, this just took out minority communities and especially Black communities. There was initial optimism for Black communities thinking, oh, our city, our town is going to be cleaned up. It's going to be nicer. There's going to be better housing. But it quickly faded when it became clear that many thousands of individuals were going to be displaced from their homes and not given another place to live, and they had to find it for themselves. And then with this became the creation of highways and transportation. So a lot of urban renewal led to the creation of highways. So in this image on the bottom, this is Detroit, but you can see that all that housing exists on one side, and that's been this way. And then with urban renewal, it's cleared out. So there's highways and transportation, which you'd think is great, but now all of those people, all those houses that you see are gone, and they have to figure out a new place to live and to exist. And then this kind of ties in the Bay Area Rapid Transport. It was known as BART. And that's what cleared out a lot of Black-owned businesses and homes just for the sake of travel. And then chapter 5, that starts talking about the war on poverty. So if you're not familiar with that, it was an initiative from President Lyndon B. Johnson in the response to the national poverty rate. It was extremely low, and it was these policies that were going to be put in place to elevate this line, so the poverty wasn't as deep. And some of these policies included different congresses and committees that I'm going to be mentioning in this chapter. So CORE is one of them, the Congress of Racial Equality. It was brought together by the NAACP, and it also came in contact with the Civil Rights Coordinating Committee, the CRCC, which was a combination of the CORE with churches, fraternal organizations, and ministerial alliances, along with liberal white church congregations. So with the war on poverty, Robert Self considered this to be both in tandem and tension with the civil rights movement and their efforts to expand opportunity for Oakland's African American community. So it kind of worked with and against, it pushed and pulled. And with those two committees, you can kind of see that there's active efforts to eliminate poverty, especially in the African American community, but there's a lot of struggle that comes with it. Something that we've mentioned in class that comes out of this is the affirmative action. So in particular, the affirmative policy that these two committees called on the city to endorse fair employment and institute an affirmative policy of increased involvement of minorities in all city contracts and hiring. So like we've talked about, it's this idea that there needs to be more effort put in to ensure that minority individuals and populations are getting representation within work and giving the chance to be hired. So that was one of the big things that these two committees fought for. And then as they kind of did their thing and more came in, the ad hoc committee to end discrimination follows after them. So this committee, it worked to, it was in offspring of the W.B. Du Bois Club in San Francisco, and it was an alliance between the new white left and young Black activists. So it was like a little bit newer, and it was a little bit catchier to the younger populations coming out of Oakland, specifically as we're leading up to the Black Panther Party's emergence and legacy in Oakland. In another instance that Robert Self mentions is the Bank of America protest. So core leaders demanded that bank officials disclose the racial composition of its workforce and then enter into a fair employment process pact that would ensure fairness in all future hiring. So kind of playing on affirmative action. And Bank of America ended up negotiating an agreement with them and working on ending this discrimination. So then moving into chapter 6, this is the chapter I found to be the most interesting. Specifically looked at the efforts of the Black Panther Party and the establishment of Black Power. Self kind of sees this as a striking difference between two different sides of the civil rights movement. So the nonviolent Martin Luther King Jr. era to the more violent Malcolm X era. I see them kind of fading into each other, but he sees them a bit more starkly as their own pieces. And then he talks about the definition of Black Power, which fades into language, dress, clothes, materialistic ideas, and kind of what it did for the community as a sense of self-confidence and community confidence. So then talking about the Oakland Economic Development Council, or the OEDC. This also worked to help with Oakland's poverty rates, and it later becomes the OEDCI, the Oakland Economic Development Council Incorporation, which becomes an independent nonprofit organization that's no longer subject to the policies of city council. So this is kind of ways that individuals worked within the government and without to work towards lessening poverty. And the Black Panther Party specifically had calls towards making sure there's full employment for our people, as they referred to the rest of their community, decent housing, and an immediate end to police brutality. So they kind of worked alongside with and against these other councils. And then chapter 7 talks about the white noose surrounding the urban Black community. It's literally titled The White Noose, and it's this idea that suburbia is so embedded in a white supremacy idea that it has forced urban Black communities and individuals into different living situations and just puts it under their thumb. It denies access to employment and housing markets and that sort of thing. So the California Real Estate Association got people to believe that property is the highest social good and should remain the least regulated. That was kind of their calling card. So this is moving towards the privatizing of land, which really leads into using housing as a vessel for white supremacy, because who's entitled to this land, who's forced to live on other land, which even ties way back into just colonization in general and the relationship between land with Native Americans and colonists. It's 1960s, 1970, but it's still present. And then it leads into employment discrimination. So a lot of African American individuals are being forced out of Oakland because they can only find jobs in places like the East Bay, where there's factories like GM and Ford. So they live into those suburbs. So now you have the Oakland suburb, which is full of white people and white families, and then the East Bay suburb, which automatically is going to be considered, the nice place to live, the ghetto place to live. And then you've got segregation. And so that was the big focus in chapter 7. And then chapter 8 really goes into the decline of the city. And like I've mentioned, the decline of many industrial cities at this time. So it's the 1970s, and they're just not being used in the same way as they once were. So there's a big decline. And it also keeps continuing with talking about the Black Panther Party and their views towards the future. So something that was really big was intercommunalism. This idea that a collection of communities were dominated by the US and its global allies, and it's just a fight against imperialism. So it was this concept that we could band together against the power of the United States, specifically this white supremacist power. Since Black communities have been under their thumb for so long, it's their time to flip a switch and take back this sort of idea and their place in society. The chapter also finishes with talking about the election for mayor and city council in Oakland in 1973, with Bobby Seale running for mayor and Elaine Brown for city council. The big result from this was massive voter registration. Although neither of them ended up winning, it led thousands of African Americans to register to vote, which was a huge success. And then the 1978 tax revolt. So this is a response to the taxes that were being forced onto individuals in California and how high they were, in opposition to how high they were for businesses. It was also considered to be an attack on liberalism and influence residential segregation with the tax levels. And so then talking about scholarly references, I found that a few different historians and scholars called on Robert Self's work in their own work. So to start, Donna and Charles Hamilton, they're both professors, I believe. Donna's a professor of social work and Charles for government, have argued national civil rights organizations maintained a dual agenda in the post-war decade. So they fought for racial equality and consistently sought expansion of the welfare state and the social wage for all workers. And Robert Self promotes a modified framework for conceiving this relationship between Black-led political movements and the liberal welfare state. So he plays on this dichotomy that they bring up in their own research. And then also with Kenneth Jackson, he has work on the history of the suburb. It's very well known. And he thinks it should be understood as a consumption from two impulses: subsidizing of American middle class by federal government and privatization of public sphere. So Robert takes both of those ideas in his writing, and he builds off of it with the inclusion of its effects within racism and discrimination. So the three most important things I learned: to start, I was unaware of the liberation schools and survival programs from the Black Panther Party. I didn't know that they had these sorts of things. So daycare facilities, free breakfasts for children, sickle cell anemia testing, shoe and clothing programs, health clinics, massive grocery giveaways. To be honest, I've always known about the Black Panther Party, but I feel like education has kind of led us to believe that, they were just the more violent side of the civil rights movement. And I would even argue that this book does that a little bit. But he does mention all these initiatives to them, which I found to be really interesting, and how much they worked within the community. And then I was also just shocked at the number of parties and organizations dedicated to the movement, to government, that sort of thing. These are just 3 others that were mentioned in the book that came from different places. But I feel like the amount of acronyms that I listed off was just it was a lot, which was really interesting to see how much effort was going into it. And also the toll urban renewal takes on a whole community. That's another thing that I knew of, but not to this extent. And I wasn't aware that it would have taken out complete businesses along with the housing. So one of the major critiques that I found was by Margaret Pugh O'Mara. And she says that the book falls short in its portrayal of the Latinx and Asian politics. So it lacks conversation on the degree of how these multiracial demography affected Black access to jobs and housing. I agree with this statement. I do think the book could have used a little bit more information on what was happening in society rather than just all these policies. And then she also talks about how the civil rights activism of the region's other racial national groups complemented or impinged upon that of the Black community in Oakland. And I agree with that as well. I think it would have been really interesting to see how they reacted with each other. But I do understand that that wasn't the point of his book. She also says it's too dense and could have benefited from editing and reiterates points that are well discussed elsewhere in the book. I definitely agree with that. Even just going through my notes on it, it felt like there were a lot of concepts that he covered, which was great. But if it was a bit more streamlined, I think it would be a bit more effective in informing the reader on civil rights, specifically looking at housing and poverty. He takes on a lot, and I think he does it well, but I do agree that is a bit dense. And then another critique comes from Kenneth Durr, and he evaluates self-argument for over white suburbanization. And that self reduces him to homo economicus, which I don't care for the gendered language. And I don't 100% agree with Durr's argument, but I'll say more after I talk about it. So Durr believes that these people thought in terms of affordable homes, safe streets, and good schools too. And historians might at least consider that they were sincere. So that's a quote from his article. And I understand that he's arguing that, you know, people want to live in suburbs because they're nice, which, yes, true. But there's a reason that suburbs are set up the way they are, the communities that they are. And I think that Self does a good job at establishing the connection that it has to white supremacy, because you really can't ignore it when you look at all the other systems that are being put in place. And then he also critiques on Self's use of Marxian terms and that the workplace is rarely mentioned. I do think it would have been interesting to talk about specific places that Black individuals are working, but again, that's not this book. That's not the point of this book. So I don't completely agree with this critique. And then how it fits into our course. While I was reading it, I definitely saw connections to our conversations about housing rights, voting rights, fighting for a voice within government, especially within Northern Ireland. I felt like there was a lot of parallels, and just the evolution of the civil rights movement in the United States that we're beginning to discuss, and how we had to move into a more violent, if you could say violent, way of protection, because that's the way that this happened. And these are images from the Civil Rights March in Ireland, as well as in South Africa. And then class conversations over generational wealth and its lingering effects. So we still have suburbs and evidence of class divisions within housing, and we still have police brutality. And these are things that we've been talking about in our course, so that's how I saw the connection. And then for my discussion question, Self argues we should avoid lumping the civil rights efforts of different cities together. What are the benefits to looking at each city separately rather than seeing all their efforts, accomplishments, and setbacks as one? And that's my works cited. So thank you for listening, and sorry about that little hiccup there.